Ethan Carter had been waiting for this moment for weeks. The moving boxes had been unpacked. The stress of settling into a new home had finally started to ebb, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he could relax. The sun beamed down, its warmth seeping into his skin as the glistening water of his pool beckoned him to unwind. He was alone, just the way he liked it. His drink was perfectly chilled, his book lay open in his lap, and the hum of the world seemed far away. This was supposed to be a moment of peace, but the serenity was about to shatter. It started with a voice, a sharp, cutting tone that sliced through the tranquil afternoon like a knife. "Excuse me, who do you think you are?" Ethan blinked and squinted against the glaring sun, the words not quite registering at first. He shifted in his lounge chair, searching for the source. There, at the edge of his yard, stood a woman. She was dressed in expensive, yet garish clothes, her posture rigid and self-important. There was something about her, something almost magnetic in the way she carried herself. She had that look of someone who thrived on making others uncomfortable. A person who believed the world was her stage and everyone else mere players. Ethan had never seen her before, but it didn't take a genius to guess that this woman was trouble. "Who the hell is this?" he thought to himself. But he wasn't about to let her ruin his afternoon. With a bemused smirk, he relaxed further into his chair, crossing his arms and taking a slow sip of his drink. "I think I'm a guy enjoying his own pool," he said, raising an eyebrow, trying to keep his voice even. The woman scoffed, taking a few steps closer. Her eyes narrowed, scanning him with a mix of confusion and disdain. "You don't belong here," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "Who let you in?" Ethan paused for a moment, utterly perplexed. "Let me in? Lady, I live here," he said slowly, emphasizing the last part. He gestured toward the house behind him. "Been here for about a month. Maybe you just weren't paying attention." The woman's face twisted into a scowl, as if she'd just bitten into something sour. "I don't believe you," she muttered under her breath, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "This house has been empty for months. Now, suddenly, some random man is lounging by the pool. You expect me to believe that?" Ethan fought the urge to roll his eyes. Was this woman for real? But instead, he shrugged casually and took another sip of his drink. "Believe whatever you want," he said, trying to keep things light. "But I'm not trespassing." The woman's lips curled into a thin, tight line, and then, in one swift motion, she pulled out her phone. Ethan watched, a sense of dread slowly building in his stomach. "I'm calling the police," she declared, her fingers already dialing. "We'll see what they think about some stranger lounging around a house that isn't his." Ethan let out a low sigh, the tension in his shoulders mounting. This was happening. Of all the ways he'd imagined his peaceful afternoon being interrupted, this had not been one of them. He couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. "Go ahead," he said, shaking his head. "Let's waste some taxpayer dollars today." As the woman stepped back, her voice rising in pitch and volume, he could hear her ranting into the phone about a suspicious man lounging in a vacant home. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the ridiculousness of the situation wash over him. This woman was actually calling the police on him for sunbathing by his own pool. Minutes later, he heard it, the sound of sirens, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. Two police cruisers appeared at the end of the street, their lights flashing, the sound of their sirens adding to the already tense atmosphere. Ethan turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on the officers who had stepped out of the cars. Both of them were scanning the area, their hands resting near their belts, ready for anything. But as they saw Ethan, lounging in his swim trunks with sunglasses on, drink in hand, their demeanor shifted. It was almost comical. The officers looked at him, then exchanged a glance with each other. They clearly hadn't expected this. One of the officers, a stocky man with a weathered expression, stepped forward, followed by his partner, a tall woman with sharp eyes. The woman's gaze moved from Ethan to Karen, who was already rushing toward them, flailing her arms in desperation. F.C.E. Thank God you're here, Karen shouted, her voice straining with false urgency. This man is refusing to leave. The officers didn't move at first. They exchanged another look, clearly bewildered by the situation, before the man addressed Ethan. Sir, we received a report that you're trespassing on private property, he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of disbelief. Ethan, still reclining on his lounge chair, lifted his sunglasses, giving the officer a bored look. Uh-huh, that's news to me, he replied sarcastically. Pretty sure I live here. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. He's lying, she yelled, stepping forward. This house was empty for months, and now suddenly he's here, acting like he owns the place. The officers exchanged skeptical glances again, clearly used to dealing with false reports. Ethan couldn't help but smirk, the tension in his body melting into something almost humorous. This was ridiculous, but Karen wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The tension in the air grew heavier with each passing second. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the officers as they slowly approached him, their faces unreadable. He could hear the distant hum of Karen's ranting, but it was starting to blur into background noise. She had already begun spinning her story, her words a cacophony of exaggerations and half-truths. But Ethan didn't feel the need to react. He had nothing to prove. His gaze shifted to the two police officers who now stood before him, their postures a stark contrast to the chaotic energy Karen exuded. The stocky officer, a man who appeared to have seen it all, gave Ethan a measured look, his eyes flicking back and forth between him and Karen. There was something almost professional in his manner, as though he was used to people like Karen, the ones who found drama in the most mundane of situations. His partner, a tall woman with sharp eyes, mirrored his skepticism. She stood a little straighter, her posture rigid and no nonsense. Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the officers would see through Karen's theatrics. Sir, the stocky officer began, his voice steady but clipped. We received a report that you are trespassing on private property. Ethan's lips twitched into a lazy smile as he slowly lifted his sunglasses, his eyes locking onto the officers. That's news to me, he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Pretty sure I live here. Karen, whose face was now flushed a deep shade of crimson, stepped forward dramatically. She was practically shaking with indignation, her hands waving wildly in the air. He's lying, she shrieked, her voice pitched high with a blend of fury and desperation. He's not supposed to be here. This house has been vacant for months, and now suddenly he's lounging by the pool, acting like he owns the place. Ethan couldn't help but roll his eyes. This woman was unbelievable. He remained motionless, a picture of calm in the face of her frantic energy. He could practically feel the frustration rolling off of her in waves, but he wasn't going to let her drag him into her mess. Lady, he said, his voice calm but cutting, I'm not trespassing. I live here. My name's on the deed. The taller officer glanced at her partner, then back at Karen. The skepticism in her gaze was palpable. She took a slow step forward, her eyes scanning Ethan with a quiet intensity. Do you have identification, sir? She asked, her voice even, but there was a note of concern now. Not for Ethan, but for the situation. It was clear they were both trying to gauge just how deep this rabbit hole went. Ethan raised an eyebrow and gestured to a small side table beside his lounge chair, where his wallet and house keys sat neatly next to his phone. Help yourself, he said, barely moving. I've got my license, my house key, and some utility bills, if you need more proof. The officer nodded and reached for his wallet. She flipped open Ethan's ID, her eyes scanning it carefully. Ethan wasn't worried. His name matched the address on the driver's license, and she could see the keys to the house in plain sight. The proof was irrefutable. Ethan Carter, the officer muttered to herself, reading the name aloud as if testing the authenticity of the situation. This address matches. She looked up at him, her eyes flicking briefly to Karen before she continued. "And you have keys to the house. I don't see a problem here." The stocky officer, who had remained silent until now, sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Karen with a tone that bordered on exhaustion. "Faking government-issued IDs isn't exactly a simple crime. And even if he did steal the keys, which, frankly, seems pretty far-fetched, he still wouldn't be here by accident. He's obviously not trespassing." Karen, however, wasn't backing down. Her face twisted into a mask of frustration and fury. "Well, just because he has a license doesn't prove anything. He could have stolen those keys. He could have faked the ID. Just check inside the house," she pleaded, her voice becoming increasingly shrill. "Go ahead. Quiz him on what's inside the house. I bet he doesn't even know what's in there." Ethan's patience was beginning to wear thin, but he didn't show it. Instead, he yawned and stretched lazily, the sheer absurdity of the situation threatening to break through his calm exterior. "You want them to check inside the house? Fine by me," he said, motioning for the officers to go ahead. "Karen here seems really invested in this mystery." The officers exchanged another glance, this one laden with both skepticism and annoyance. But they had their duty, and if they were going to avoid this escalating further, they would need to verify the situation. The stocky officer turned toward Ethan. "Sir, would you mind if we took a look inside, just to verify everything?" Ethan leaned back in his lounge chair, grinning. "Be my guest," he said. "I've got nothing to hide. And, frankly, I think you're going to find exactly what you expect." The officers walked inside the house, with Karen trailing behind them, her face a portrait of desperate hope. Ethan remained seated, watching them go, fully aware of what was coming. He didn't know whether to feel pity or annoyance for Karen, perhaps a mix of both. Inside, the officers took a brief but thorough look around. They noted the family photos on the walls, the mail addressed to Ethan, and even the overly friendly golden retriever who bounded toward them with a wagging tail, eager for attention. It was clear that this wasn't the home of a squatter. The officers stepped back outside moments later, and Karen's smug expression quickly turned to one of shock. "Well?" she demanded, her voice dripping with a mix of defiance and uncertainty. "Did you find anything suspicious? Did you catch him lying?" The stocky officer sighed, his patience clearly thinning. "This is his house," as he said simply, his tone final. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her face ashen, her lips quivered, and for the briefest of moments, Ethan thought she might actually admit defeat. But that was never going to happen. "No," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "That can't be right." Ethan, leaning casually against the doorframe, shot her a wicked grin. "Well, Karen," he said, his voice almost too sweet, "looks like I'm not a squatter after all. Bummer, huh?" The taller officer, who had been silent up until now, crossed her arms over her chest, the weight of her words settling in the air. "You just wasted police resources on a false report," she said coldly. "If you continue to harass your neighbor, there will be consequences." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the officer held up a hand, silencing her. "Enough," the officer said firmly. "You're done here." With one last furious glare at Ethan, Karen stormed off toward her house, her pride wounded, but her war far from over. Ethan could already tell this wasn't the last he would see of her. Ethan leaned back into his lounge chair, savoring the sweet, rare satisfaction of victory. The scene had played out exactly as he'd hoped. The police had seen through Karen's lies, and now she was left standing on the wrong side of the truth. But as he watched her storm off toward her house, her face twisted with rage, a sense of unease settled in his chest. This wasn't over. People like Karen didn't back down. They didn't just take an L quietly and disappear. No, they regrouped. They retaliated. He sighed, lifting his glass to his lips, his mind already working overtime. He could almost feel the wheels turning in Karen's head. She would never just let this go. The woman was spiteful, obsessive even, and she'd made it clear that her mission was to restore her sense of control. And Ethan? He was just another obstacle in her way. A voice cut through his thoughts, dry and amused. Well, well, looks like Queen Karen is at it again. Ethan turned his head, smiling as James Parker, his neighbor across the street, strolled up his driveway. James had lived in the neighborhood for years and was, for lack of a better term, an expert in handling Karen's kind of nonsense. A retired lawyer in his late 50s, James had seen it all, and when it came to people like Karen, he had a knack for knowing exactly how to play the game. James leaned against the fence, eyes twinkling with mischief. I was just wondering how long it would take before she pulled something like this on you, he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Ethan chuckled, sipping his lemonade. Oh, so she's got a history of this, huh? James let out a laugh, one that spoke volumes about his distaste for Karen. Oh, you have no idea. Last year she called the cops on a Girl Scout because she thought she was running a shady operation, selling cookies without a permit. Ethan raised an eyebrow, a bemused grin spreading across his face. You're joking. I wish I was, James said, shaking his head. I saw the whole thing from my porch. I even sent the HOA president a message. She should be here any minute. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. The HOA president? Susan Caldwell? The no-nonsense woman who ran the show around here? He'd heard of her, but he wasn't sure how much influence she actually had over someone like Karen. Still, if there was a chance this whole thing could backfire on Karen, Ethan was all for it. He took a long sip of his drink, waiting for the next twist. Minutes later, he saw a sleek black sedan pull up to the curb, its polished exterior gleaming in the sun. A woman in her mid-40s stepped out, her posture straight and unyielding. It was Susan Caldwell, the HOA president. She was known for her no-nonsense attitude and, from what James had said, her complete intolerance for drama. Karen was in for it now. Ethan watched with quiet amusement as Susan marched up the driveway. But just as she reached the front door, Karen emerged, her face flushed with fury. Susan, thank God you're here, she practically screeched, her voice high-pitched with desperation. You need to do something about this. This man is trespassing. Susan didn't even blink. Karen, she said, pinching the bridge of her nose in an almost tired gesture. I just got off the phone with the police. They said this was another false report. Karen's face contorted with disbelief. False? He's lying. I've never seen him before. This house has been empty for months, and now he's lounging by the pool. Susan crossed her arms, a look of mild annoyance crossing her features. Karen, his name is on the HOA records. His property taxes are up to date. His utilities are in his name. I even have his application documents from when he moved in last month. Karen opened and closed her mouth like a fish, clearly struggling to find a way to continue her tirade. Susan was too calm, too collected. She had all the facts at her disposal, and there was nothing Karen could do to refute them. Susan's voice cut through the air like a blade. This is harassment, Karen. We've had enough complaints about you already. James sent me a message about what happened just now. If you keep this up, we'll have no choice but to take action. James, who had been standing nearby, couldn't resist a chuckle. He leaned in toward Ethan and whispered, She's about to get roasted. Karen's face twisted into a grimace of fury. She tried to save face, her words tumbling out in a frantic mess. You can't do this. I pay my dues. I have a right to be heard, she shouted, her voice shaking. Susan raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Not when you waste everyone's time with this ridiculous paranoia. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. It was clear that the tables had turned. She had underestimated Ethan, and now the HOA was about to deliver a public smackdown. James stood back, an amused grin on his face, as he watched the exchange. "This is better than Netflix's," he whispered to Ethan, who couldn't help but grin in return. Karen's meltdown was pure gold. Susan didn't waste any more time. "Karen," she said, her tone like steel, "you've been fined twice already for calling the police over nonsense. If you do it again, we'll have grounds to ban you from HOA meetings. And I'm issuing an official restraining order on further complaints." Karen's eyes went wide, her face pale. She was about to protest, but Susan silenced her with one final, crushing sentence. "You've been warned." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen was cornered, defeated, and the weight of her actions began to settle on her shoulders. She spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, her steps full of impotent rage. Ethan stood there for a moment, his gaze following her retreating form. He couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Karen had lost, and though he knew this wasn't the end, it sure felt damn good to see her finally get what she deserved. Karen's fury had only just begun to boil over. The encounter with Susan in the HOA had been humiliating, yes, but Karen wasn't one to let such a defeat slide quietly into the past. No, her mind was already whirring, plotting and planning her next move, and this time she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Ethan had been too smug, too sure of himself, but she would make him pay for his arrogance, for daring to stand up to her. The very next morning, as the sun rose over the quiet neighborhood, Karen's retaliation began. Ethan had barely stepped out onto his porch to collect the morning paper when he noticed something off. It wasn't the usual peaceful street scene. No, there was a tension in the air, a subtle change that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. A few of his neighbors were gathered in small groups, their voices hushed and eyes shifting uncomfortably. Ethan frowned. Something was wrong. He couldn't quite place it at first, but then, like a storm cloud rolling in, he saw it. Flyers. The brightly colored paper was plastered across the neighborhood like a grotesque warning. The words "warning" and "dangerous trespasser" blared in bold capital letters at the top of each flyer. Ethan's stomach twisted in an instant as his eyes landed on the blurry photo of him by his pool. His face was barely distinguishable, but there was no mistaking the context. His image, displayed like a criminal's mugshot, accompanied a list of ridiculous accusations: illegally occupying a vacant home, refuses to identify himself, do not engage, call police immediately. He stared at the flyer, a sickening feeling settling deep in his gut. This was it. This was Karen's final act of desperation. She had taken the absurdity of their confrontation and twisted it into something dangerous. Ethan had been expecting her to retaliate, but not like this. She had gone beyond just calling the cops. She had gone public. She was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against him, to paint him as some kind of criminal. Fury flashed through Ethan's veins as he tore the flyer down from the nearest light pole, crumpling it in his fist. This was low, lower than anything he had anticipated. Karen wasn't just seeking revenge. She was trying to ruin his reputation, to make him the villain of his own story. But he wasn't going to let her win. As he stood there, grinding his teeth in anger, James Parker appeared beside him, a bemused expression on his face. He had been watching from his porch, no doubt enjoying the show. But even James could see how far Karen had gone this time. "She's lost her damn mind," James muttered under his breath, glancing over at the nearby flyers. Ethan couldn't agree more. Karen had clearly underestimated the lengths she was willing to go to. The twisted campaign of fear and suspicion had only just begun. But the best part? Ethan wasn't about to let her have the last word. "You know," Ethan said slowly, a dangerous edge to his voice, "I think I'll leave them up." James raised an eyebrow. "What?" Ethan's lips curled into a wicked grin. "Yeah, let the whole neighborhood see exactly what she's trying to do. Let them know she's the one spreading lies and stirring up trouble. Let her flyers speak for themselves." James chuckled. You're playing a dangerous game, but I like it. By noon, the entire neighborhood was talking. The flyers, now in full view on every street corner, had become a point of mockery rather than fear. The more people saw them, the more they realized just how absurd Karen's accusations were. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispers, but not the kind Karen had hoped for. Instead of fear, there was laughter, derision, and an overwhelming sense of community against her petty, spiteful actions. Ethan could hear it in the laughter that echoed through the neighborhood. People were talking about the flyers, but not with the alarm Karen had hoped to incite. One neighbor had even edited the flyer, turning it into a parody. "Local pool enthusiast strikes again," the new headline read. Another neighbor had photoshopped a wanted poster with Ethan's face, sharing it in the neighborhood Facebook group. The joke was out there now. Karen had turned herself into a laughingstock. But it wasn't just the residents who were reacting. A few kids in the neighborhood had taken to TikTok, reenacting the entire encounter between Ethan and Karen. Their skits went viral, with one video racking up thousands of views in a matter of hours. It was all starting to backfire on Karen in ways she couldn't have predicted. Her tirade, her obsession with making Ethan the villain, had instead made her the punchline. And as if that wasn't enough, the final blow came swiftly. Susan Caldwell, the HOA president, arrived at Karen's doorstep with an envelope in hand. James and Ethan watched from a distance, knowing exactly what was coming next. Karen, still seething with rage, stormed out of her house as soon as she saw Susan's car pull up. She could barely contain her fury. "They can't do this," she screeched, waving her arms frantically. "This is a violation of my rights." Susan's gaze was cold, her voice firm. "Karen," she said, cutting through the air with the precision of a scalpel. "YOUVE harassed a homeowner, wasted police resources, and spread defamatory flyers about a neighbor. You're being fined $2,500. Karen's face went pale. She gasped, stumbling back a few steps, as though the words had physically struck her. Ethan could feel the rush of triumph surge through him. It was happening. Karen was being held accountable for her actions. "If you don't pay," Susan continued, "we will take further legal action." The neighborhood was alive with murmurs. As Karen's world began to crumble around her, Ethan stood tall, his grin widening as Karen turned on her heel, stomping back into her house, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. It was over, and Karen, for all her bluster, had no one to blame but herself. For the first time in weeks, Ethan could breathe easy. The storm that Karen had stirred up had passed, and with it, the tumult of her schemes and accusations seemed to have evaporated. It wasn't just the fact that she had been publicly humiliated, though. That was certainly satisfying. It was the quiet that followed. A sense of peace settled over the neighborhood like a blanket, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan could sit back, truly unwind, and not worry about the chaos brewing around him. The first few days were blissfully calm. Ethan spent his mornings by the pool, the sound of the water rippling gently as the sun beamed down. He felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders as he relaxed, enjoying the simple pleasures that had eluded him during his hectic move and the relentless tension with Karen. His house was finally his sanctuary, untouched by the madness that had tried to creep in. It was exactly what he had wanted when he first moved here. But even in the stillness, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't give up easily. The satisfaction of watching her fall from grace, the HOA fine, the public shaming, all of it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. But it wasn't until he caught sight of Karen's house that he realized just how much of an impact this had all had. One morning, as he stepped out onto his porch, a familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb. For a moment, Ethan thought nothing of it, but then he saw the "for sale" sign in Karen's front yard. He stopped dead in his tracks, a knowing smile slowly spreading across his face. Karen had done what she did. Best she had retreated. But this time, it was different. She wasn't just retreating from him, she was retreating from the neighborhood, from everything she had built with her petty power plays and relentless need for control. James, always on the lookout, spotted the sign too. He sauntered over with a sly grin on his face. Well, 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 looks like she's finally done. Packing up and leaving town, huh? Ethan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the sign. Looks like it, he said, quietly. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of finality in the air. The threat of Karen's drama had dissipated, leaving only the empty space of her former home and the peaceful neighborhood she had once tormented. It wasn't long before neighbors started talking. The word spread quickly that Karen was selling her house. Some of them were surprised, others simply relieved. And then, the true irony of it all began to sink in. Ethan had noticed the whispers at first, the quick glances exchanged behind his back. People were talking, sure, but not about the absurd flyers she'd posted, not about her. False accusations. They were talking about Ethan. They were talking about how he'd survived Karen's nonsense, how he'd managed to come out on top despite everything. James wasn't the only one who noticed. More than once, neighbors approached Ethan, congratulating him for handling the situation with grace. One woman, a middle-aged mother with a toddler on her hip, even called out, "Welcome to the neighborhood. You just survived your first Karen meltdown." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Glad to be here," he said, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the people around him. "And glad she's gone." But even more than the sense of relief that Karen was gone, there was the satisfaction of knowing that the neighborhood had rallied around him. In the end, Karen's antics had brought everyone closer. They weren't just neighbors anymore, they were a community. And in the wake of her departure, the place felt lighter, freer. The streets weren't filled with whispers about the dangerous trespasser anymore, and the HOA meetings had become tolerable once again. People could finally breathe without the constant tension of wondering what Karen would do next. A week later, Ethan was sitting in his backyard, enjoying a quiet evening by the pool when he heard the sound of laughter drifting over from across the street. He looked up and saw a group of new neighbors unloading boxes from a moving truck. They were young, cheerful, and seemed normal, nothing like the chaos Karen had brought. One of the men, in his early 30s, waved at Ethan from across the yard. Ethan smiled and waved back, feeling a sense of ease settle in his chest. The new neighbors were already talking to him, asking about the neighborhood, about local spots to eat and things to do. It was clear they were excited to start their life here. They had no idea what had happened before, and that was the beauty of it. The past was gone, and with it, Karen's toxic influence was no longer a shadow hanging over the block. "Hey, you must be Ethan," the new neighbor called out as he made his way over. "I'm Ryan. My wife and I just moved in." Ethan stood up, extending his hand with a grin. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Ryan. Hope you're ready for a little excitement." Ryan chuckled, glancing at the house across the street. "We heard. My wife saw your story online. Something about a Karen who tried to turn the whole neighborhood against you." Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's about the gist of it. But don't worry, she's long gone now." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "And you're still here?" Ethan's grin widened. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home." As the day turned into night, Ethan found himself hosting a small barbecue for the new neighbors, James, and a few others from down the street. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, music, and the smell of grilled food. Ethan finally felt like he belonged here. The house wasn't just a place to live, it was a home. And with Karen gone, it was finally peaceful. He was surrounded by people who genuinely cared, people who wouldn't turn on him at the slightest provocation. As the evening wore on, Ethan sat back in his lounge chair, watching the sunset with a satisfied smile. The neighborhood, once so fraught with tension and fear, now felt like the haven he had always dreamed of. And for the first time in a long while, he could finally say it, peace had returned. The end of Karen's reign of terror wasn't just about her leaving. It was about the strength of the community that had endured her madness. And now, Ethan could truly enjoy his pool, his home, and his life in peace, knowing that the worst was finally behind him.